Welcome to Headliners Forum. We're here to bring you the best in Texas journalism, the stories behind the great stories. I'm your host, Mark Morrison. Our special guests are Perla Trevizo and Jolie McCullough of the Texas Tribune. They and their team won the Foundation Showcase Silver Award for their series on Operation Lone Star, Texas Multimillion Dollar Crackdown on the Border. Texas Tribune collaborated with ProPublica, the Marshall Project, and the Military Times. After Governor Abbott proclaimed the operation a success, citing 11,000 criminal arrests and apprehension of millions of lethal doses of drugs, the series revealed that a lot of the boasts from the governor and state law enforcement were wrong or grossly exaggerated. The Tribune reports had a major impact on public policy. Congratulations, Perla and Jolie, on your great reporting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jolie, why don't we start with you? What interested the team in this story, and how did it become a major investigative effort?
Sure. Well, I think this was just something where the governor was making a very drastic change and implementing a lot of new policies right out of the gate. And right away, we were hearing a lot of numbers coming from the governor's office themselves as to how this was going, how many arrests there were, how many pounds of drugs they were seizing. And for me, I'm a criminal justice reporter. So the interest on my end was that the governor's operation had really erected this new criminal justice system specifically for migrants, largely the part of they were arresting a lot of people for trespassing on private property after they were suspected of having crossed the border illegally. And this was something that they set up completely new court systems. They set up completely new, they turned some state prisons into jails. So it was a whole new world essentially of criminal procedure. And it was something that I felt we really needed to keep a close eye on. And then the rest of the team was really digging into, okay, how can we trust these numbers, right? Like they were giving out all of these numbers of what exactly how successful the operation was, and that was something that Perla and the others decided, we really need to dig into this. How are they getting these numbers that seem somewhat implausible at this point, and how are they standing on these numbers? And so they really dug into that and found that, in fact, a lot of the numbers did not make sense.
Right. Perla, one of the findings was that the state was counting many crimes as border related that really had no connection with migration or the border. What was going on there?
Yeah, so for months, as Jolie said, we would see this almost weekly press conferences where they would cite numbers of arrests, pounds of drug seized, gang members arrested. And so we start with a very simple question: can you please give us the data behind those numbers? Like, you obviously need individual figures to provide a total, and that proved extremely difficult. So we were going back and forth for almost months. The different data sets that we were getting kept changing. The parameters kept changing. They were including counties that were far from the border, and that, at least to our knowledge and from what we were being told, did not include Operation Lone Star resources. For example, for fentanyl, they were tallying the fentanyl that was being seized across the state. We ended up finding that there were about 2,000 charges unrelated to the border that were being included, that they ended up changing after our reporting, and we came back to them. They also ended up, out of those, about 270 charges were for violent crimes. And so they in the mix of the numbers that we're seeing in the press conferences, there was not only counties that had no Lone Star resources or were far from the border, but charges like cockfighting, stalking, domestic violence that had nothing to do with what we would consider border related crime.
And so what were some of the reporting tactics that you employed to get the facts here? The officials were not forthcoming really when you were challenging them on some of these numbers. Perla.
I mean, I think, yeah, part of it was persistence, right? And that's the advantage of us working together and getting together with other media outlets that do, where we can complement each other work. So we can take the time to, we comb through social media accounts and press releases to gather statements where, for example, they had said, we've arrested over 700 gang members. And so when we would ask for the data about gang members, they would come back to us and say, that's not something we keep. And so we can go back and show, like, here on Facebook on this day, this is what you posted in terms of what was the outcome of Lone Star. We they did give us a meeting where we sat down with them and try to understand and ask our questions and explain where we were and what was not making sense. We were working with a data reporter from the Marshall Project, so we were having ongoing conversations. We were being transparent and sharing our findings, and this is a mismatch and this is what's not working. So I think it was, a lot of persistence and being fortunate to work at places that give us the time that it requires to do this kind of work. A lot of public records requests that we kept updating and having to follow up. So a combination of tactics to, ultimately show and the public, it was important for us to show the public where this money, how this money was being spent, because we were talking about billions of dollars at this point.
Yeah. Jolie, some of your fellow team members developed some very strong sources in the Texas National Guard, and they found a lot of morale issues and some abuses that came about as a result of bringing the Guard into unfamiliar roles such as guarding the border. How did that reporting unfold?
Sure. I think, again, this is one of those things that comes with great partnerships, right? We had a great partnerships with the Military Times, who has the reporter has already developed all of these sources inside the military compound. And this was something that, I had been since, July 2021, this is being rolled out. I had really been hammering on this is how the system is, all the errors in the system in terms of arresting migrants. But this was something that I think really touched on a different level of interest for readers, which was, our colleagues were reporting on, the National Guard members don't want to be down there either. This is something that they were forced into, and they are now dealing with horrible living conditions. They're dealing with not getting paid, and they're dealing with, one drowned. So it's just like they're also dealing with these intense situations where they are being pulled away from their home life for months and months at a time, which this is supposed to be, short stints of time with no end in sight. And that's something that I think resonated with a lot of readers, is just these are volunteers who are being put in these horrible situations for, and being mistreated in a lot of ways in terms of not being paid and things like that. So that was something that I think came with, again, great partnerships with the Tribune having the resources it has and the Military Times having the resources that it has.
Right. Perla, what about the DPS? That was a difficult source that your team members had to deal with. And how did they prevail and get the story behind some of the questionable information that the Department of Public Safety was releasing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we were having constant conversations throughout the process. We believe in being, again, transparent with what we're doing. They did offer a ride along for one of our reporters, but I think they were insistent that, basically that when they talked about fentanyl, it was okay to talk about statewide seizures. When we were talking to former DPS and other law enforcement experts who were telling us, if you want to measure a success of an operation, you measure what was added to, what the resources that were added to a particular region or community. So it was very difficult to even gauge what areas of the operation we were talking about. That kept changing. it was difficult to gauge how many resources had been added to certain communities because they wouldn't provide those numbers. And so I think, even though DPS did give us time and did offer, put their lawyers on the phone with us and walk us through some things, they were essentially, they viewed it differently from what we were hearing from law enforcement, including former DPS officers, as to how you measure success. And this had been part of a pattern of previous operations. So another piece we did is that, Texas had other border operations throughout the years, but we couldn't find any record of the full list of the operations, how long they had lasted, where were they located, how much had they spent, what was the result, how were they measuring success? Because at times success was measured by, if there were more arrests, that was success. Other times, if there were less arrests or less drug seizures, that was success. And so we basically compiled lists based on public records and previous coverage, newspaper clippings, to put together this list that shows year after year, this has been the issue and the same questions have been asked. And here we find ourselves, over 10 years later with some of the same issues from the beginning. So I think for DPS, they had been questions about this kind of work before, but it seems that there was more data collected. It was still unclear what exactly it was capturing.
Yeah. Jolie, the Department of Justice had took a role after some of your stories reported on some of the prosecutions that were occurring with some of the migrants. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was something that, again, I had been reporting on all the errors in the prosecution, errors in the courts, just with these small towns that were being inundated with thousands of arrests of migrants for misdemeanor charges of trespassing. And there were violations in terms of passing statutory deadlines for how long someone is allowed to be in jail without being appointed a lawyer, for how long they're allowed to be there without, having a charge actually filed against them. So this is something that was really drawing the attention of a lot of civil rights lawyers, and they were getting involved, and they had asked the Department of Justice to intervene, and that's something that Perla found, I believe, when she was going through some of her many records requests. There was a letter that we found because the Department of Justice didn't announce that they had opened an investigation. It was just referred to in many state agency letters. Well, like, oh, well, now with the DOJ investigation, we have to do this. So that's something that, on the front end, it was great to see that this is something that, our work in terms of the accountability angle is getting the attention of federal investigators. And it's also great to see that we are able to highlight that instance, that accountability, again, by our investigation of getting all of these records.
Yeah. And Perla, there was also an impact in the Texas military after your stories reported on some mistreatment of Guard soldiers and some other problems. Obviously, what were some of the changes made after some of your stories appeared?
Yeah, after our teammates' coverage, there was improvements of housing. There were efforts to fix the pay issues that they had highlighted. The drowning that Julie mentioned earlier. One of the things that they uncovered is that they hadn't, I think, acquired the life-saving devices needed. So there were efforts to change that. There were people removed, leadership removed, or left on their own accord. So those were also some of the changes that came about from that reporting.
Right. And Jolie, clearly the record migration under Biden's policies has created some concerns about national security and a rise in illegal drugs and exploitation of migrants. Have you guys found any successes the state has had in dealing with the problem that federal actions seem to have actually exacerbated?
I mean, it's really unclear in the sense that, the numbers are still very high in terms of number of crossings. So this doesn't have, I mean, we looked over and over again for years, and it doesn't seem that this has had a deterrent effect. It is costing Texas, the state, billions and billions of dollars with the price tag that keeps going up. But there are successes in terms of the governor will announce, hey, we just arrested this known cartel member. We've arrested this person who was bringing in X amount of drugs, but it's really unclear, how much of that would have been happening anyway, right? Like, there's still police at the border, regardless of a military operation as the National Guard being there, regardless of if all of state police is kind of switched over to the border. So it's really hard to tell if these things would have happened anyway. And it's also, I think, incredibly important to note that, those token cases, those cases that are being highlighted are the minority in terms of who is being arrested, who is being swept up into this system that, Texas taxpayers are paying for, and overburdening jails, using the state prison system now, and just in terms of, the majority of these people who are being arrested for low-level offenses.
Right. And Perla, obviously this crisis, serious problem continues on. We now hear about a lot about the continued busing of migrants to other states that Texas is doing. And now the floating wall, which has been controversial and seems to be a target of some kind of federal action. What is your assessment of the continuing saga here?
I think both sides of the political spectrum would agree there's an issue, right? When you have large numbers of people coming, the question is what is the state role in this? Immigration is a federal issue. So even the DPS troopers, if it's not for criminal trespassing, they have to contact the Border Patrol. The National Guard has to contact the Border Patrol. And as Jolie mentioned, even with the concertina wire, the buoys, it might serve as a deterrence in that area. But what we're seeing is that people walk even further to surrender to authority. So I think, the question of whether it's working or not is one that we're still are asking. I think it's important to continue follow precisely because of the amount of money being spent, and because these are a buildup of previous operations. Immigration continues to be a interest, high stake interest nationally and in Texas. The question is it working? What is the state's role? And after, I guess, two years or more than 2 years of Operation Lone Star, what have we accomplished? Where are we? And what do the numbers tell us?
Jolie, for our student viewers, how would you suggest they prepare for a journalism career and doing the kind of outstanding investigative reporting that your team did?
I would say, read a lot of great journalism. I think that always sets you up for learning kind of the ins and outs, what questions to ask, what things are, just give you ideas for what types of things are out there, and how to go about them. Learn about your state and federal open record laws, right? What can you get from the government? What is public information? What are you able to find through that? And learn how to fight against them when government agencies might not be very forthcoming, as they often are not. I also just think it's really important to just practice your interviewing skills. I think the biggest thing is get out on the ground and see what's happening, and don't be afraid to ask what you might think is a stupid question, or what you might think might be perceived as an aggressive or combative question. Be polite, don't be rude to people, but you can ask whatever you want. And I think, be inquisitive and be persistent. These are the fundamentals of journalism.
Very good. Jolie and Perla, our judges were impressed with the team's relentless pursuit of the facts and your great storytelling. Thanks again for sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can see the entire Texas Tribune series and interviews with other top journalists on our site, headlinersfoundation.org. For Headliners Forum producer Gary Pickle, I'm Mark Morrison.